While trying to forge my husband's will, my daughter-in-law handed me a paper already signed. "Just sign here. It's for your own good, old lady." I signed it, but not what she expected. She didn't know about the clause. I'm glad to... Have you here? Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. Sign here. It's for your own good, old lady. Those words still echo in my mind whenever I think about that day. The day my daughter-in-law Wren showed her true colors. It was barely 3 weeks after I'd buried Paul, my husband of 40 years, when she sauntered into my kitchen with that document tucked under her arm. I was still wearing black. Still waking up reaching for Paul's side of the bed. Still finding his reading glasses in odd places around the house. Grief had settled into my bones like arthritis, making every movement, every breath, a conscious effort. "What is this?" I asked, my hands trembling as I took the papers from her. The legal jargon swam before my eyes, deliberately confusing. Something about transferring property rights. Something about simplified estate management. Wren flipped to the last page, her red fingernail tapping impatiently on the signature line. "It's just standard paperwork to make things easier for everyone, Sherry. The lawyer says it needs your signature." Her smile never reached her eyes. It never had in the 15 years she'd been married to my Kenneth. I'd noticed it at their wedding, how she looked at my son like he was a prize she'd won, and at Paul and me like we were obstacles she'd need to overcome. "Which lawyer?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Mr. Thompson hasn't mentioned anything about this to me." A flash of irritation crossed her face. "A different lawyer? More efficient? Look, do you want Kenneth to have to deal with all this complicated legal stuff while he's grieving his father?" The mention of my son's grief, which I'd barely witnessed, made my heart ache. Kenneth had become increasingly distant over the years. The phone calls grew shorter, the visits rarer. Paul had noticed it too, the way our once affectionate boy would check his watch during family dinners, his attention divided between his phone and Wren's silent signals. "I should read it first," I said, reaching for my reading glasses. Wren let out an exaggerated sigh. "Honestly, Sherry, it's all standard legal language. You'll just confuse yourself." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspirator's whisper. "Paul would have wanted things to be easy for you, for all of us." The mention of what Paul would have wanted nearly broke me. But then I remembered our last private conversation, 3 days before cancer finally took him. He'd been so weak by then, his once robust frame whittled down to bones and translucent skin. But his mind, his beautiful, sharp mind, had remained intact until the end. "Sherry," he'd whispered, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll be careful after I'm gone." "Don't talk like that," I'd pleaded, though we both knew his time was measured in days, not years. "Listen to me," he insisted. "Wren will try something. I've seen how she looks at what we have, not as a home we've built, but as assets to be divided." I took the pen from Wren's manicured hand. I signed the document, but not the one she thought. You see, Paul hadn't just been talking that day. He'd been warning me, and more than warning me, he'd prepared me. The document I signed was actually a notarized statement that Paul had helped me prepare with our real lawyer, Mr. Thompson. A statement declaring that any attempt to coerce me into signing property transfers would be considered elder abuse and fraud. Wren didn't know about the clause in Paul's real will, the one that stated any attempt to manipulate the inheritance would result in immediate disinheritance. She didn't know that the security camera Paul had installed in the kitchen bookshelf last year, disguised as a vintage cookbook, was recording our entire interaction, and she certainly didn't know that I'd been a paralegal for 20 years before retiring, that I could spot a fraudulent document from across the room. "There you go, dear," I said, sliding the paper back to her with a trembling hand. I even let my voice quaver a bit for effect. "Is there anything else you need?" The triumph in her eyes made my stomach turn. No, that's all for now. I'll let Kenneth know you've been cooperative. He'll be so relieved. After she left, clutching what she thought was her ticket to my home and savings, I sat at the kitchen table and wept. Not from fear or helplessness, but from a profound sense of loss. Not just of Paul, though that grief was still raw and bleeding, but of the family I thought we had built. Where had we gone wrong with Kenneth? How had he become so distant, so easily influenced by Wren's material hunger? When had his visits become transactions rather than connections? As I sat there, surrounded by the home Paul and I had built over 4 decades, I felt his presence so strongly I almost expected to see him walk through the door, newspaper tucked under his arm, that gentle smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. I did what you asked, Paul, I whispered to the empty room. I protected what we built. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for Wren to walk into it. And when she did, she would learn what Paul had always known, that underestimating me would be her biggest mistake. What she saw as weakness, my age, my grief, my seeming confusion, was actually my greatest strength. Because when people think you're a pushover, they never see the pushback coming. The reading of the official will was scheduled for Friday. 3 days away. 3 days for Wren to believe she had won. 3 days before she would discover what Paul's last act of love truly was, not just for me, but for the son who had lost his way. I still remember the day Kenneth brought Wren home. It was spring, cherry blossoms dotting our front yard like pale pink snow. Paul had spent the morning grilling, his specialty, while I prepared the potato salad and lemonade. Our son had called the previous night, unusually excited. Mom, I've met someone special, really special. Can I bring her to Sunday lunch? Kenneth had always been our sensitive child. Thoughtful, perhaps too eager to please. At 35, he'd had his share of relationships, but none that prompted a formal introduction. So naturally, Paul and I were thrilled. When they arrived, Kenneth seemed different somehow, standing taller, his movements more deliberate, as if performing for an invisible audience. And then there was Wren, striking with her dark hair and calculating eyes that assessed our home within seconds of crossing the threshold. "What a charming little place," she'd said, accepting Paul's handshake. "So, quaint." I remember catching Paul's eye across the patio, that subtle raise of his eyebrow that had always been our secret language. "Be careful with this one," his look said. But Kenneth was smitten, laughing too loudly at her jokes, touching her arm constantly, seeking her approval before offering his own opinions. It was subtle at first, the way he deferred to her, checked her expression before responding to our questions. "Kenneth tells me you're in real estate development," Paul had asked over dessert. Wren dabbed her lips with the napkin I'd embroidered for our 30th anniversary. "Yes, I have a knack for seeing potential where others see only the present value." Her eyes swept across our backyard, the garden I'd tended for decades. "Like this property. Quite a sizable lot for just 2 people, isn't it?" 6 months later, they were engaged. The wedding was elaborate, far beyond what we'd expected or what Kenneth could afford. Later, I learned Wren had insisted they take out a loan rather than accept our offer to help. "We don't need their money," she'd told him, not realizing I was just around the corner in the hallway of their new apartment. "Besides, they'll be leaving it all to you eventually anyway." The first year of their marriage, we still saw Kenneth regularly. He'd come by on weekends, sometimes with Wren, often without. "She's working," he'd explain, though the excuse grew. Thinner as months passed. Then came the subtle changes. Kenneth stopped coming for our traditional Sunday dinners. When he did visit, the conversations felt rehearsed, his laughter forced. The phone calls became shorter, less frequent. "He's a grown man with his own life," Paul would say, though I could see the hurt in his eyes. "We can't expect him to check in every day." But it wasn't just the reduced contact that concerned us. It was the transformation in our son, the Kenneth we knew, who volunteered at the animal shelter, who wrote thoughtful birthday cards, who called just to share a sunset, was fading, replaced by someone we barely recognized. "Did you see that watch he was wearing last week?" Paul had whispered one night as we lay in bed. "Must have cost a month's salary." "And the way he dismissed your advice about the stock market," I added. "You've been investing for 40 years. And suddenly he thinks you're out of touch." The real turning point came 3 years into their marriage. Kenneth and Ren were having financial troubles, their lifestyle exceeding their means. We offered to help, not with a handout, but with guidance. Paul had always been good with money, building our modest savings through careful planning and wise investments. Ren had shown up alone at our door, a rare occurrence. "Kenneth's too proud to ask," she'd said, settling into our living room like a queen granting an audience. "But we could use some temporary assistance," Paul had been direct. "We'd be happy to help you both create a budget, look at your expenses, maybe—" "We don't need financial advice." She'd cut him off, her smile sharp as a blade. "We need capital, for an investment opportunity." When Paul gently declined to hand over cash without details, suggesting instead that we discuss it together with Kenneth, her mask slipped. Just for a moment, but long enough for us to see the coldness beneath. "I thought family was supposed to support each other," she'd said, voice dripping with disdain. "But I guess that only applies when it's convenient for you." That night after she left, Paul had held me as I cried. "We're losing him, aren't we?" I'd whispered into his chest. "Not yet," Paul had said firmly. "But we need to be careful. Very careful." From that day forward, our relationship with Kenneth became increasingly strained. Ren was always there, a barrier between us and our son. When they did visit, it was usually with an agenda. Questions about our retirement plans, comments about the maintenance our house needed, inquiries about Paul's life insurance. "She's preparing for our deaths," Paul had remarked darkly after one particularly transparent dinner conversation, taking inventory of what they'll inherit. When Kenneth announced they were expecting a baby, our hearts soared with hope. A grandchild. Perhaps this would heal the growing rift, bring our son back to us in some way. The pregnancy seemed to soften Ren, or at least her strategy. She allowed Kenneth to visit more often, even came along sometimes, letting us fuss over her growing belly. We transformed our home office into a nursery, ready for visits with our grandchild. Little Emma was born on a snowy December morning. Beautiful, perfect, with Kenneth's gentle eyes. For a brief, shining moment, our family felt whole again. Kenneth brought her to visit weekly, his face alight with a father's love. Then, just as suddenly, the visits dwindled. Excuses mounted. Ren had rules, schedules, concerns about germs. "Mom, Dad, you know how it is with newborns," Kenneth would say apologetically over the phone. "Ren is just being cautious. The nursery we'd prepared sat unused. The toys we'd purchased remained in their packaging." Our granddaughter became a stranger we saw only in the photos Kenneth occasionally sent. And then Paul got sick. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis came like a thunderclap on a clear day. Sudden, devastating final. 6 months, the doctor had said gently. Perhaps a year with treatment. That's when everything changed again. Suddenly, Ren was interested in visiting. Suddenly, she had questions about our will, our life insurance, our savings. Suddenly, she was very concerned about Paul's comfort and peace of mind. "We should discuss getting your affairs in order," she'd suggested, not 2 weeks after his diagnosis. For Kenneth's sake, for Emma's future. Paul, even weakened by his first round of chemotherapy, had fixed her with a steady gaze. "My affairs," he'd said quietly, "are perfectly in order." What Ren didn't know was just how ordered they truly were. or that Paul had already seen through her plan and devised one of his own, his final act of love and protection for me, and ultimately, for Kenneth and Emma too. The doctor's words hung in the sterile air of the consultation room. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. I felt Paul's hand tighten around mine, a silent anchor in the storm that had just been unleashed upon us. "What's the prognosis?" Paul asked, his voice steady despite the death sentence we'd just received. 6 months, the oncologist replied gently. Perhaps a year with aggressive treatment. I remember nothing else from that appointment. Not the treatment options discussed. Not the pamphlets pressed into my trembling hands. Only the quiet dignity with which Paul received the news, as if it were merely an inconvenient change of plans rather than the end of our life together. That night, as we lay in bed, Paul turned to me, his face half illuminated by moonlight streaming through our bedroom window. "Sherry," he whispered, "I'm not afraid of dying, but I am afraid of leaving you unprotected." I tried to assure him that I would be fine, that our savings were adequate, that the house was paid off. But we both knew he wasn't talking about financial security. He was talking about Ren. The news of Paul's illness traveled quickly through our small family circle. Kenneth called immediately, his voice thick with emotion that reminded me of my real son, not the stranger he'd become under Ren's influence. "Dad, I'm so sorry," he'd said. "What can I do?" Before Paul could answer, I heard Ren's voice in the background, shushing our granddaughter Emma. "Ask them if they've updated their will recently," she whispered, clearly not intending for us to hear. Paul's eyes met mine across the kitchen, where I held the extension phone. A sad understanding passed between us, confirmation of what we'd long suspected. After that call, Ren's visits increased dramatically. She'd arrive with Kenneth and Emma in tow, a picture of family devotion. But while Kenneth spent time genuinely connecting with his father, perhaps sensing the precious little time they had left, Ren would inevitably find ways to separate me from the group. "Sherry, why don't you show me that antique china collection you mentioned?" she'd suggest, steering me toward the dining room while Kenneth sat with Paul. Once alone, her questions were always the same, wrapped in different packages but transparent nonetheless. "Have you and Paul discussed what will happen to the house? Does Kenneth know about all your accounts, or should I help you make a list? That grandfather clock must be valuable. Is it mentioned specifically in your will?" Each question cut deeper than the last. While Paul fought for his life, undergoing treatments that left him exhausted and in pain, Ren was already dividing our possessions in her mind. The worst came 3 months into Paul's treatment. I'd been at the hospital all day with him for a particularly difficult chemo session. When we returned home, weak and weary, we found Ren in our study, the drawer of Paul's desk open. "Oh," she exclaimed, not quite managing to look embarrassed. "I was just looking for some stamps. Emma wants to mail a drawing to her grandfather." Later, Paul checked the drawer. "She was looking for the will," he said, his voice flat with resignation rather than surprise. That night, despite his weakness, Paul made a phone call to Mr. Thompson, our lawyer and friend of 30 years. The next morning, he asked me to help him dress in proper clothes, not the soft pajamas he'd taken to wearing during treatment. "We're going out," he announced, a shadow of his old determination flashing across his gaunt face. "Paul, you're not strong enough," I protested, watching him struggle to button his shirt with fingers numbed by neuropathy. "For this I am," he replied. We spent 3 hours in Mr. Thompson's office that day. What transpired there would change everything. Though Ren wouldn't discover that for months to come. Paul had always been methodical, a planner who left nothing to chance. Cancer hadn't changed that part of him. If anything, it had sharpened his foresight, his determination to protect what mattered. "The problem," he explained to Mr. Thompson, "is that Kenneth is still in there somewhere, beneath Ren's influence. I don't want to punish my son for his wife's greed. Mr. Thompson, who had drafted wills for half the town over his long career, nodded thoughtfully. You want to protect Sherry without disinheriting Kenneth entirely. And our granddaughter, Paul added. Emma deserves a legacy untainted by her mother's machinations. What they devised was both simple and brilliant, a clause that would activate only under specific circumstances. An ethical tripwire that Wren, in her blind greed, would almost certainly trigger. It's not vindictive, Paul insisted on the drive home, as if reading my troubled thoughts. It's protective. Sometimes love means creating consequences that prevent further harm. As Paul's condition deteriorated, Wren's mask slipped more frequently. She began bringing real estate brochures to our home, casually leaving them on the coffee table. Have you considered downsizing, Sherry? She'd ask while Paul napped in the next room. This place will be so much work for you alone. Kenneth and I could help you find something more manageable. Each time I would smile vaguely and change the subject, playing the role of the overwhelmed soon-to-be widow. It wasn't entirely an act. The grief of Paul's impending death was very real, a weight that made it hard to breathe sometimes. But beneath that grief was a growing steel core of resolve, forged in the fire of Wren's transparent greed. In his final weeks as hospice care began and the hospital bed was installed in our living room, Paul had moments of startling clarity amid the fog of pain medication. During one such moment, when we were briefly alone, he gripped my hand with surprising strength. Remember the plan, he whispered. Let her think she's winning. Let her show her true self. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. Even dying, he was protecting me. Even leaving, he was finding ways to stay. I've loved you since you wore that blue dress to the town dance in 1966, he said, his voice suddenly stronger, reaching back through decades to the beginning of us. I'll love you long after I'm gone. 2 days before he died, Wren arrived alone, a rare occurrence. Kenneth was at work, she explained, and Emma was with a sitter. She sat beside Paul's bed, taking his withered hand in hers with well-practiced tenderness. I stood in the doorway watching. You know, I'll take care of everything, she told him, her voice honey-sweet. Sherry, Kenneth, Emma, we'll all be taken care of with what you've built. Paul's eyes, sunken but still sharp, found mine over Wren's shoulder. A lifetime of love and shared understanding passed between us in that glance. Then he turned to Wren, summoning the last of his strength. Yes, he said, his voice barely audible. Everything will be taken care of. Exactly as it should be. He died in his sleep 2 nights later, my hand in his, the clock on the mantel marking the passage of time into a world without him. I felt the moment he left, not with drama or fanfare, but with a quiet slipping away, like the tide retreating from shore. And as I sat there, hollowed by grief yet strangely calm, I knew that the battle Paul had prepared me for was just beginning. The funeral was a blur of black clothes and casseroles, of hands squeezing mine, and voices offering condolences that couldn't penetrate the fog of my grief. I remember Kenneth's face, tear-streaked and vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy. For a few hours, my real son returned to me, the one who existed before Wren. He sat beside me during the service, his arm around my shoulders, steady and present. Wren, meanwhile, played her part flawlessly, the devoted daughter-in-law, organizing the reception, managing the flow of visitors, making sure I ate and drank. To anyone watching, she was the picture of familial support. Only I noticed how she steered conversations with Paul's older friends toward their own estate planning, how her eyes cataloged every mourner who mentioned something Paul had left them. A fishing rod, a book, a cherished memory. After everyone had gone, when the house echoed with new emptiness, Kenneth approached me tentatively. Mom, Wren and I have been talking, he began, his voice gentle but rehearsed. We think you should come stay with us for a while. The house will be so empty without Dad. Before I could respond, Wren appeared at his side, her hand possessively on his arm. "We've already prepared the guest room," she added, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "And Emma would love having her grandmother around." I thought of the grandchild I barely knew, of the sterile guest room in their house where I'd sat awkwardly during rare visits. Then I thought of Paul, of our bedroom, where his pillow still held the indent of his head, of his cardigan hanging on the back of his reading chair. "That's very kind," I said carefully, "but I need to be here, in our home." Disappointment flickered across Wren's face, quickly masked. "Of course, but the offer stands. We just worry about you all alone in this big house. This big, valuable house on its sizable lot. The house that had been in Paul's family for generations. The house Wren had been eyeing since the first day she'd stepped foot in it. 3 days after the funeral, Mr. Thompson called. "Sherry, are you up for a meeting? I need to go over some details with you before the official reading of the will." I agreed, and the next morning found myself back in the familiar office, sitting in the same chair where Paul and I had finalized his plan months before. "How are you holding up?" Mr. Thompson asked, genuine concern in his eyes. He'd known Paul since law school, had been best man at our wedding. "I'm managing," I replied, the words inadequate but true. "Some moments are harder than others." He nodded, then leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "Sherry, I need to explain exactly what you'll be facing in the coming days. Wren has already called my office twice, pushing for an expedited reading of the will." "She's nothing if not predictable," I said, a ghost of a smile touching my lips for the first time since Paul's death. Mr. Thompson opened a thick folder. "Paul's plan is in place, but you need to understand your role completely. The success of this depends on your ability to let Wren think she's in control." What unfolded over the next hour was a detailed explanation of the trap Paul had set, a trap baited with Wren's own greed, designed to spring only if she tried to manipulate or cheat me. Paul had created 2 documents, the official will that would be read to the family, and a separate sealed letter that would only be opened under specific circumstances. The will itself was straightforward, leaving the house and the majority of our assets to me for my lifetime, with provisions for Kenneth and Emma after my passing. "The key is the special clause," Mr. Thompson explained. "It states that any attempt to coerce, manipulate, or defraud you out of your inheritance will trigger immediate consequences." "Disinheritance," I said quietly, remembering Paul's reluctant determination. "Not exactly," Mr. Thompson replied, sliding a document across the desk. "Read this carefully." As I scanned the legal language, understanding dawned. Paul hadn't set up a punishment. He'd created a safeguard. If Wren attempted to manipulate the inheritance, control of Kenneth and Emma's portion would be placed in a trust that I would oversee, ensuring that Wren could never access it directly. "It protects Kenneth and Emma from her financial control," I breathed, recognizing the elegance of the solution. "Without cutting them off entirely." Mr. Thompson nodded. "But for this to work, Wren needs to reveal her true intentions. She needs to try something that clearly violates the terms. Which means I need to appear vulnerable," I finished. "An easy target." "Exactly. Can you do that, Sherry? Can you play the part of the grief-stricken widow who doesn't understand finances? Who might be easily convinced to sign something she shouldn't?" I thought of Paul in his final days, of his trust in me, of the love that had sustained us through 40 years of marriage. "Yes," I said firmly, "I can do that." Before I left, Mr. Thompson handed me a small device. "Paul arranged for this too. It's a recording pen. Keep it with you whenever Wren is around." I slipped it into my purse, the weight of it both foreign and reassuring. When is the official reading? Friday morning, 10 a.m. Everyone named in the will has been notified. As I drove home, Paul's plan unfolding in my mind, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Grief at the necessity of this elaborate scheme, anger at what our family had become, and beneath it all, a flicker of something I hadn't felt since the diagnosis. Hope. Hope that somehow, through this final act of protection, Paul might help heal what had been broken. The next day, right on cue, Wren arrived at my door alone. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her expression, practiced sympathy. "Sherry, I brought some lunch," she announced, holding up a paper bag from the deli in town. "I thought we could talk." I let her in, playing my part. Shoulders slightly slumped, movements hesitant, voice soft with grief. None of it was entirely an act. The loss of Paul was still raw, a physical ache that followed me through each day. But beneath the genuine sorrow, I was alert, watchful. As we ate sandwiches at the kitchen table, Wren broached the subject I knew was coming. "Kenneth and I have been thinking about the reading tomorrow," she said, her tone carefully casual. "He's worried about how complicated these legal matters can be, that perhaps we should simplify things for everyone." I took a small bite of my sandwich, chewing slowly. "Simplify how?" Wren reached into her purse and pulled out a document. "This is just a simple transfer form. It would put the house in joint ownership between you and Kenneth now, rather than waiting for all the probate." Nonsense. The recording pen sat in the pocket of my cardigan, capturing every word. I reached for the document with trembling fingers, not entirely feigned, as anger made my hands unsteady. "I don't understand all this legal language," I said, squinting at the paper. "You don't need to," Wren assured me, her voice honey-sweet. "It just makes things easier. Mr. Thompson will explain at the reading tomorrow, but this speeds up the process." I looked up, allowing genuine tears to fill my eyes. Paul always handled these things. Wren's expression softened with calculated sympathy as she pressed a pen into my hand. "That's why Kenneth wants to help now. To take that burden from you, just like his father would have wanted." I thought of the real document this one would replace, Paul's carefully constructed will with its protective clauses. I thought of the house we'd lived in for 40 years, where we'd raised our son, where Paul had drawn his last breath just days ago. "Where do I sign?" I asked, my voice deliberately faint. Wren flipped to the last page, pointing to the signature, line with her manicured finger. "Right here. Then we can put all this legal business behind us." I signed my name, not on her fraudulent document, but on the witness statement Paul and I had prepared, the one declaring I was being pressured to sign something against my interests. "There," I said, sliding the paper back to her. "All done." The smile that spread across Wren's face was triumphant, predatory. She tucked the document into her purse without even checking what I'd actually signed. "You've done the right thing, Sherry," she said, patting my hand condescendingly. "Paul would be proud." Yes, I thought as I walked her to the door. Yes, he would be. The trap was set. Tomorrow at the reading, it would spring shut. The morning of the will reading dawned bright and clear, the kind of beautiful spring day that Paul would have spent in the garden. I stood at our bedroom window, watching. Sunlight filter through the cherry blossoms he'd planted on our 30th anniversary. Somehow, it felt right that today, the day his final plan would come to fruition, the trees he'd nurtured were in full bloom. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple black dress that Paul had always liked. Not the expensive one Wren had once commented on. That must have cost a fortune. Did Paul spoil you like that often? But the modest one he'd bought me for our anniversary 5 years ago. As I fastened his mother's pearl necklace around my throat, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Grief had etched new lines around my eyes and mouth, but beneath the sorrow was a quiet determination that reminded me of him. "I'm ready," I whispered, as if he could hear me. Kenneth picked me up at 9:30, alone for once. As we drove to Mr. Thompson's office, he seemed nervous, fidgeting with his tie, avoiding my eyes. "Wren will meet us there," he explained without being asked. She's dropping Emma at preschool. I simply nodded, studying my son's profile. He looked so much like his father, the same strong jaw, the same crinkles around his eyes when he smiled. When had those worry lines formed on his forehead? When had the boyish enthusiasm faded from his eyes? Kenneth, I said softly, no matter what happens today, I want you to know how much your father loved you. He glanced at me, startled. I know. That, Mom? Do you? I asked. Because there were times these last few years when I wondered if you remembered. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. Things have been complicated. Yes, I agreed. They have been. We lapsed into silence then, the weight of unspoken truths filling the space between us. As we pulled into the parking lot of the law office, I spotted Wren's sleek black car already waiting. She stepped out as we approached, immaculately dressed in a tasteful charcoal suit, her expression solemn but with an undercurrent of barely contained anticipation. "Sherry?" she greeted, air-kissing my cheek. "How are you holding up?" "As well as can be expected," I replied, the practiced response rolling off my tongue. Mr. Thompson welcomed us into the wood-paneled conference room where Paul and I had sat, so many times, planning for this very day. His assistant brought coffee and water, then discreetly withdrew, closing the door behind her. "Thank you all for coming," Mr. Thompson began, his voice formal as he opened a leather portfolio. "We're here to discuss the last will and testament of Paul James Morton." Wren leaned forward almost imperceptibly, her eyes fixed on the documents being arranged on the table. Kenneth sat stiffly beside me, his hand finding mine under the table, a gesture that caught me by surprise. Mr. Thompson began reading the standard legal preamble, then moved to the substance of the will. "To my beloved wife, Sherry Ann Morton, I leave our family home at 423 Maple Street and all its contents, to be hers without restriction for the duration of her life." Wren's smile tightened slightly, but she nodded as if this was expected. "Upon Sherry's passing," Mr. Thompson continued, "the property and remaining assets will be divided equally between our son, Kenneth Paul Morton, and a trust established for our granddaughter, Emma Grace Morton, to be accessible to her upon her 25th birthday. So far, everything followed the straightforward pattern Paul had outlined. Nothing that would alarm Wren. Nothing to suggest the trap that lay waiting. Additionally," Mr. Thompson said, turning a page, "I have established a modest trust for my wife's immediate use, separate from our primary accounts, to ensure her comfort and security." This was the bait, the suggestion of a separate account that Wren wouldn't have known about. Right on cue, Wren cleared her throat. "Excuse me, Mr. Thompson, but is there a specific provision regarding the family investment portfolio? Kenneth mentioned his father had discussed transitioning management of those accounts to him." Mr. Thompson peered at her over his reading glasses. "I'm getting to that section, Mrs. Morton. There are some specific conditions attached." Before he could continue, Wren reached into her purse and pulled out the document I'd signed the day before. "Actually, I believe this might simplify matters," she said smoothly, sliding the paper across the table. "Sherry has already agreed to transfer partial ownership of the house to Kenneth. She signed this yesterday." Kenneth looked startled. "Wren, we didn't discuss—" "It was your mother's idea," Wren cut in, her voice honey-sweet. "Wasn't it, Sherry?" All eyes turned to me. I allowed my hands to tremble slightly as I reached for my water glass. I'm not sure what I signed, I said, my voice deliberately faint. Wren said it would make things easier. Mr. Thompson took the document, studying it with a frown. "This appears to be an attempt to circumvent the probate process by transferring the deed of the house directly to Kenneth, with Sherry retaining only a life interest." "My mother agreed to this?" Kenneth asked, turning to Wren with confusion. "Of course she did," Wren insisted. "She knows managing such a large property will be difficult for her alone." Mr. Thompson set the document down carefully. "I'm afraid this creates a complication, Mrs. Morton. You see, there's a specific clause in Paul's will that addresses exactly this type of situation. He turned to a marked page and began to read. I hereby stipulate that any attempt to coerce, manipulate, or pressure my wife into transferring assets left to her in this shall be considered a violation of my expressed wishes and will trigger the immediate activation of the protective trust provisions detailed in the attached sealed letter. The color drained from Wren's face. What does that mean? Mr. Thompson reached for a sealed envelope on the table. It means Paul anticipated this scenario. This contains his instructions for what happens now. As he broke the seal and began to read, the room fell silent. In the event that the protective clause has been activated, I hereby revoke the direct inheritance rights previously granted to my son, Kenneth Paul Morton, and establish instead a supervised trust containing his portion of my estate to be managed by my wife, Sherry Ann Morton, until such time as she deems appropriate to release control. Kenneth stared in shock. Dad did what? Furthermore, Mr. Thompson continued, any assets intended for my granddaughter, Emma Grace Morton, shall be placed in a similar trust, also under Sherry's sole discretion, until Emma reaches the age of 25, with no access granted to her parents. Wren's composure finally cracked. This is ridiculous. You can't possibly enforce this. Sherry is elderly, confused. She didn't understand what she was signing. Mr. Thompson calmly reached for another folder. Actually, we have evidence suggesting otherwise. He pressed a button on a small recorder, and my voice filled the room, crystal clear despite the device being hidden in my cardigan pocket. This is just a simple transfer form, Wren's recorded voice said. It would put the house in joint ownership, between you and Kenneth now, rather than waiting for all the probate nonsense. My response followed. I don't understand all this legal language. You don't need to, Wren's voice assured. It just makes things easier. Mr. Thompson stopped the eye. Recording. Additionally, what Mrs. Morton actually signed yesterday was not the property transfer she believed, but a notarized statement prepared by Paul before his death, documenting her awareness that such an attempt might be made. He slid a copy of the actual document I'd signed toward Kenneth. As my son read it, his face drained of color. Wren, he whispered. What have you done? Wren stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is a setup. She tricked me. No, I said, my voice stronger now, the pretense of frailty falling away. Paul protected me from you. There's a difference. Wren turned to Kenneth, her eyes wild. Are you going to let them do this? Cut us off from what's rightfully ours? Kenneth looked from her to me, decades of manipulation battling against the truth laid bare before him. In his eyes, I saw the painful dawning of recognition, of what his wife truly was, of what she'd been doing all along. What's ours? He repeated quietly. Or what's yours, Wren? Because I'm starting to wonder if there's a difference anymore. Summer turned to fall, and the garden Paul had loved so much transformed with the seasons. The cherry trees shed their blossoms, yielded their fruit, and now their leaves had turned a brilliant gold. I sat on our back porch with a cup of tea, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. 6 months had passed since that day in Mr. Thompson's office. 6 months of painful truths, difficult conversations, and slow, tentative healing. The aftermath of Paul's final act of protection had been both devastating and necessary, like setting a broken bone so it can mend properly. Wren had left the law office in a fury that day, her carefully constructed facade shattered beyond repair. Kenneth had stayed behind, sitting silently as Mr. Thompson explained the full extent of Paul's arrangements. The trust would hold Kenneth's inheritance secure until I deemed him ready to manage it independently, a responsibility Paul had entrusted to me alone. Why didn't he just tell me? Kenneth had asked as we drove home, his voice hollow with shock. About Wren. About what he suspected? Would you have believed him? I'd replied gently. Or would you have thought it was just the old-fashioned concerns of an overprotective father? He hadn't answered, but his silence spoke volumes. The weeks that followed were turbulent. Wren alternated between rage and calculated charm, trying every tactic to regain control. She threatened legal action, then tearfully apologized, claiming she'd only been trying to simplify things for everyone's benefit. When neither approach worked, she turned her manipulation to Kenneth, alternating between playing the victim and reminding him of his responsibilities to her and Emma. For a while, I feared I'd lose my son all over again as he struggled with the painful reality of his marriage. But Paul had known Kenneth better than Kenneth knew himself. Beneath the layers of influence Wren had built over 15 years, the thoughtful, caring man we'd raised still existed. Once his eyes were opened, he couldn't unsee the truth. A month after the will reading, Kenneth arrived at my door alone, his face drawn with exhaustion. "I've asked Wren for a divorce," he said without preamble. "I've moved into an apartment downtown." I'd simply held him as he cried, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of him. Later, over coffee at the kitchen table where he'd done homework as a boy, he told me everything. How Wren had isolated him gradually from his friends, controlled their finances despite his better salary, convinced him that his parents didn't respect his independence. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he'd said, staring into his mug. "I've been horrible to you and Dad. We never stopped loving you," I told him, reaching across the table to take his hand. "Not for a single day." The divorce proceedings were ugly, as we'd all expected. Wren fought for everything: the house, full custody of Emma, alimony that would have bankrupted Kenneth. But the evidence from the will reading, combined with financial records Kenneth finally examined with clear eyes, painted a damning picture of her motives and methods. In the end, the court granted joint custody of Emma, with Kenneth having primary physical custody, an outcome that had infuriated Wren more than any financial settlement could have. She'd wanted Emma not out of maternal love, but as leverage against Kenneth and, by extension, access to the trust Paul had established. The sound of tires on gravel pulled me from my thoughts. A car door slammed, followed by the patter of small feet running up the porch steps. "Grandma!" Emma called, her 5-year-old face alight with excitement as she bounded onto the porch. "We brought pizza and a movie." Kenneth followed more slowly, carrying a pizza box and a shopping bag. "Hope you don't mind the invasion," he said with a smile that reached his eyes, something I hadn't seen in years before Paul's plan unfolded. "Never," I assured him, rising to hug them both. Friday movie nights had become our new tradition over the past few months. Sometimes they stayed overnight in Kenneth's old room. Sometimes they went back to their apartment. The rhythm of our reunited family was still finding its way, but each week felt more natural than the last. As Kenneth set up the movie in the living room, Emma curled beside me on the couch, her small hand finding mine. "Daddy says Grandpa is watching us from heaven," she said matter-of-factly. "Do you think he can see our movie nights?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I think he sees everything important," I told her. "And this is definitely important." Later, after Emma had fallen asleep and Kenneth had carried her upstairs to bed, we sat together in the kitchen, much as Paul and I had done countless evenings over 40 years. "I have something to tell you," Kenneth said, turning his coffee mug between his hands. "I've been offered a teaching position at the community college. Literature, not business." I smiled, remembering how he'd loved books as a child, how he'd written poetry in high school before Wren convinced him it wasn't practical. "You'd be wonderful at that." "It's less money," he admitted. "Much less than corporate consulting." "Money isn't everything," I said. "Your father and I learned that early. We never had much, but we had enough." Kenneth nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about the trust, about what Dad intended with it. At first, I was hurt that he didn't trust me with my own inheritance. It wasn't about trust, I corrected gently. It was about protection. He wanted to make sure you and Emma would always have security, regardless of what happened with Ren. I understand that now, Kenneth said. And I've realized something else too. I don't need the money right now. The teaching job covers our expenses and we're happy in the apartment. He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. I'd like the trust to stay as it is for now. Maybe use some of it for Emma's education eventually, but otherwise let it grow. I felt a swell of pride so intense it almost hurt. This was Paul's true legacy. Not the financial provisions he'd made, but the values he'd instilled in our son, values that were finally re-emerging. Your father would be very proud of the man you're becoming, I said softly. I know I am. Kenneth's eyes glistened. I miss him. I wasted so much time. He knew you loved him, I assured him. Even when you were at your most distant, he never doubted that. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the old kitchen clock ticking steadily on the wall, marking time as it had for decades. Mom, Kenneth said finally, there's something I've been wanting to ask. The lake house in Michigan, the one where we used to spend summers when I was a kid. Do you ever go there anymore? I shook my head. Not since you were in high school. It needs work, but it's still in the family. I was thinking, he said cautiously, maybe we could go there this summer, the three of us. Try to fix it up a bit. Emma would love the lake. The suggestion caught me by surprise, unleashing a flood of memories. Kenneth learning to swim, Paul teaching him to fish, evenings on the porch watching fireflies. Our last real family times before Ren entered the picture. I'd like that very much, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Later that night, after Kenneth and Emma had gone to bed, I sat alone in Paul's reading chair, running my fingers over the worn armrest where his hands had rested for so many years. You did it, I whispered into the quiet room. Your plan worked. We're rebuilding, slowly but surely. Outside, an autumn wind rustled through the cherry trees, sending a shower of golden leaves dancing across the lawn. I thought about the seasons of our life together, the blossoming, the fruitfulness, the inevitable falling away. But even in winter, roots remain alive beneath the snow, waiting for the chance to grow again. Paul's last act of love hadn't just protected me from Ren's manipulation. It had created the opportunity for a new season, one he wouldn't see, but had made possible nonetheless. A second chance for Kenneth, a relationship with my granddaughter, a family finding its way back to what mattered. As I finally rose to go to bed, I paused by the mantel where Paul's picture stood beside the antique clock he'd loved. Thank you, I said softly, touching my fingers to his smiling face. For everything. The house creaked and settled around me, familiar and comforting. Upstairs, my son and granddaughter slept peacefully under the roof Paul had maintained so carefully all those years. Tomorrow we would wake and have breakfast together, perhaps plant bulbs in the garden for spring, take small, steady steps forward into whatever waited ahead. It wasn't the future Paul and I had planned together, but it was the one his love had made possible. And for now, for always, that would be enough. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites. And they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.